I need to pray very effectively so that I may receive all the anointing that I need for that job.
It begins with a single flame in a dark room. Kiel, Germany, 1931. Winter presses against the window panes as a Jewish school teacher, Rachel Posner, lights the first candle of Hanukkah. She speaks the ancient blessing her people have carried through centuries. Barak atah Adonai, who commanded us to kindle the Hanukkah light. The flame flickers to life, steady, warm, defiant. Then she notices it. Across the street hangs a swastika banner from a nationalist headquarters, a symbol of a movement rising in anger and pride. Two images facing one another, a newborn political darkness and a flame whose history stretches back over 3,000 years. Rachel lifts her camera and captures the moment, a moment that outlived the regime staring back at her. But to understand why this light mattered, you have to know where it came from. Its story begins long before 1931, back in the wilderness, the temple, the Maccabees, and it carries all the way into the season we're entering now. And today, for our first episode, we focus on the history of a special light. You're watching Avail, Legends of Prayer, a history program exploring the history of prayer across generations. Each episode uncovers the moments, the people, and the faith that carried God's people through their darkest hours. And as we enter the holiday season, we begin with one of history's most enduring symbols, a light that has survived empires, exile, and war. Welcome to the study. To understand why that menorah in 1931 mattered, you have to go back, not decades, but millennia, back to the very first light ever appeared in Scripture. In the beginning, the world is described as formless and void, darkness over the deep, nothing ordered, nothing shaped. And then, before land, before plants, before humanity, God speaks one sentence that becomes the foundation of every prayer tradition in Israel. Let there be light. Jewish commentators point out something interesting. Light is the first gift God gives to the world. And for Israel, light would always be connected to God's presence, God's guidance in humanity's response. This becomes the first building block of prayer history. God reveals himself and people respond. We move forward to the wilderness, a people recently freed from slavery, living in tents, learning who God is. Here, the menorah first appears. In Exodus 25, God gives Moses detailed instructions. A lampstand made of pure gold, hammered from one piece, shaped like an almond tree. Almond blossoms meant something to ancient Israel. The almond tree is the first to wake from winter, the earliest sign of life returning. To them, it symbolized watchfulness, attentiveness, God awakening his people. The menorah wasn't just decoration, it was the only source of light inside of the holy place. This is one of the earliest interactions of light and prayer in Jewish history. The flame burning besides the prayer of people. The priest tended the lamps twice a day, a practice tied directly to the morning and evening prayer, cycles that shaped Jewish life today. So from the beginning, the menorah's flame wasn't just illumination. It was the environment where prayer lived. When Solomon builds the first temple, he expands the menorah dramatically. Not one lampstand now, but 10, each made of gold. The holy place glowed with fire. And something new develops, a national rhythm of prayer. The Levites sang psalms, many of which were prayed, chanted, or recited daily. Priests offered incense while worshipers prayed outside. The temple became a center of spoken, sung, and meditated prayer. In this era, the menorah symbolizes a nation unified around prayer. But the era of Solomon does not last forever. 586 BC, Babylon breaches Jerusalem. The temple burns. The menorah, the symbol of God's presence, is taken away. For the first time in centuries, the flame goes out. And yet, this is the moment when Jewish prayer life expands with no temple, no altar, no priestly sacrifice, no holy place, no menorah. The people turned to what they can still do: pray. Synagogues form. House gatherings form. Daniel prays, facing Jerusalem 3 times a day. Ezra and Nehemiah rebuild community through prayer before rebuilding walls. Prayer becomes the new sanctuary. So even though the menorah is gone, the flame symbolically moves into the lives of the people. We move now to the 2nd century BC. A Greek-Syrian ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, bans Jewish practice. Torah scrolls burned, circumcisions outlawed, Sabbath forbidden, the temple desecrated. The flame is extinguished again, but the Maccabees rise. A priestly family who fight, pray, and take back Jerusalem. When they cleanse the temple, they find 1 jar of oil, enough for 1 night. They light the menorah anyway, and history records that it burns 8 nights, long enough to prepare new oil. From this event comes Hanukkah, and with it the blessings that the Posners would later recite in Germany. This becomes a defining moment in prayer history. Faithfulness under oppression, sparking unexpected endurance. By the time Jesus walks into the Second Temple, the menorah is again a central symbol of Jewish worship. And during the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, John records something striking. Jesus stands in the temple and says, "I am the light of the world." Every listener would have understood the connection, the menorah shining behind him, and the claim that he embodies the presence the flame represents. This doesn't erase the menorah's history, it deepens it. 70 AD, the menorah is captured. Rome destroys the Second Temple. The menorah is carried through the streets as a trophy. It is carved into the Arch of Titus, cementing its capture in stone. After that, it vanishes from the record. But Jewish sources from the period reveal something important. With the temple gone, prayer becomes the center of Jewish identity. The flame, once kept in the temple, now lives in the home, in families lighting menorahs, reciting blessings, and embracing God's faithfulness. For the next 1,900 years, Jews carry the menorah in traditions across continents: Spain, North Africa, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Germany. Through expulsions, pogroms, migration, and rebuilding, the menorah remains one of the most recognizable symbols of Jewish prayer life, and Hanukkah becomes a holiday of identity, a reminder that even when empires rise and fall, the light continues. So by the time we arrive in the 1930s, Jewish families are lighting menorahs in homes across Europe, often whispering the same blessings their ancestors used for centuries earlier. It's the long, unbroken history of prayer that meets the political tension in Germany in 1931, which brings us back to the window. When we returned to the apartment of Kiel in 1931, We're not returning to an isolated event. We're stepping into the continuation of 3,000 years of prayer tradition, meeting a rapidly changing world. Germany at this moment is not yet the world of Auschwitz and Treblinka. It is the era historians call the late Weimar Republic, a nation fractured by unemployment, political violence, and a deep cultural anxiety that left people searching for someone to blame. For Jewish communities, the changes were slow at first, too slow for many to notice, but unmistakable to those who lived at the edges. Rachel's husband, Rabbi Dr. Akiva Posner, served at a time when German Jewish life was still vibrant. The synagogues were active. Children attended Hebrew classes. Families gathered for Shabbat meals. Prayer books, Ashkenazi, Siddurim were used daily, and yet the air had begun to shift. In 1930 and 31, smaller national groups like the Stahlhelm across from their home were becoming louder. Their headquarters often doubled as meeting places for men who felt cheated by the Treaty of Versailles, men frustrated by economic collapse, men easily persuaded by the idea that Germany needed purifying. Inside the synagogues, though, life was still rooted in the unbroken patterns of Jewish prayer. Morning prayer known as Shacharit, evening prayer called Ma'ariv, the chanting of psalms, the recitation of ancient blessings kept the community spiritually anchored. This means something important. The menorah Rachel lit that night wasn't an isolated religious object. It was tied to an entire living world of prayer, memory, and identity. By 1931, Jewish families across Germany were already feeling unease during Hanukkah. Lighting the menorah near the window was still a command. Jewish law says to publicize the miracle, but many families had started placing a menorah deeper inside their homes, away from the streets, away from the eyes that might interpret it as defiance. But the Posner family followed the ancient practice as written. They set the menorah on the windowsill where it could be seen. This was not an act of protest. It was an act of continuity, a continuation of the same prayer tradition their ancestors kept alive in Babylon, Greece, Rome, Spain, and Poland. In that moment, with the swastika banner hanging across the street, two worlds collided. The world of ancient prayer history and the world of modern political extremism. Not with speeches, not with confrontation, but with a single flame meeting a growing storm. Inside the home, prayer life continued as it always had. Blessings spoken, songs sung during the Hanukkah evenings, children learning the same stories of the Maccabees that had carried the Jewish world for centuries. Outside the home, the atmosphere was thickening. New laws discussed, new flyers printed, new uniforms appearing. The menorah in the window became something it had many times before in Jewish history. A quiet statement that identity does not fade because cultural around it shifts. A reminder that prayer spoken or unspoken does not vanish under pressure. And a symbol that the world had changed, but tradition had not. It is in this setting, this tension between ancient faith and modern danger, that Rachel took her photograph, not to create a symbol, but to document her reality. A menorah, a window, a rising political force, and a prayer history older than them all. This is where the main story now moves forward, because behind that one photograph is a series of historical details most people never hear, and they change the meaning of the moment completely. Most people know the photograph, Few people know the story behind it, and almost no one knows the details that deepen its meaning. To understand the full weight of that menorah facing the swastikas, you have to look beneath the surface, into buildings, movements, inscriptions, escape routes, and the quiet prayer practice that surrounded the Posner family's life. This is where the story becomes more than symbolic. It becomes historical. When people see the photo, they assume the Posners lived across from a home with a casual hung flag. They didn't. The building across the street was Stahlhelm House, headquarters for a German nationalist paramilitary organization. The Stahlhelm, or Steel Helmets, were World War I veterans, disillusioned, angry, heavily armed, and searching for someone to blame for Germany's defeat. Historically, the Stahlhelm were known for anti-Semitic rhetoric, political intimidation, violent street presence, and openly supporting the rising Nazi movement. In 1931, seeing their flag outside your window wasn't a curiosity, it was a threat. So when Rachel placed her menorah in the window, she placed it facing an organized nationalist force, not an isolated individual hanging of a symbol. This makes her act, rooted in Jewish prayer tradition, far more courageous than the photograph suggests. Another detail most people never hear: in 1931, the swastika flag was not yet legally recognized as a national symbol. In fact, it was restricted under various Weimar regulations. Flying it publicly was often a deliberate act of defiance against the government, a political challenge, a show of power. So across the street from Posner's, you had two forms of defiance: the Stahlhelm, illegally displaying the swastika, and the Posners, lawfully obeying Jewish tradition by displaying the menorah. Two symbols to the world, each claiming history was on its side. One represented a new ideology, hungry for dominance. The other represented a prayer history carried across 3 millennia. Rachel's handwritten message is famous, but most people only know a short version. The full inscription reads, "Death to Judah." So the flag says, Judah will live forever. Germany will fall. This wasn't random. Historically, Jewish communities used a literary style called Shaviri Tefillah, loosely meaning broken prayer or prayer written in crisis. These writings often paired the threat of an enemy with a declaration of Jewish endurance, grounded in prayer. Rachel's inscription fits this model almost perfectly. It is not poetry, it is not modern commentary, it is a historically recognizable Jewish form of written prayer used during times of rising danger. She was participating in a century-old way of responding to fear. Write something that affirms the survival of the people and the collapse of the oppressor. This inscription was both personal and traditional, a continuation of the same prayer culture that carried Israel through empires. The synagogue where Rabbi Akiva Posner served was targeted repeatedly after 1931. Reports from the period describe rising harassment, windows smashed, graffiti, threatening letters, attempts to interrupt prayer gatherings. By 1931, the synagogue was surrounded by Nazi youth demonstrations. Some congregants later recalled being afraid to walk to services. This context matters because it shows the Posners weren't practicing their faith in peace. Their community's prayer life was being squeezed. Hanukkah celebrations were increasingly risky. The menorah in the window was part of a prayer life already under pressure. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, Germany began restricting Jewish movement almost immediately. The Posners left just days before major immigration barriers took effect. Historical notes from surviving community members suggest that Rabbi Posner felt a strong sense that it was time to go. A conviction shaped by not only political insight, but by the inner world of prayer that governed Jewish decision-making at the time. Their departure timing is so precise that if they had waited less than 2 weeks, their exit from Germany would have been nearly impossible. This is not dramatic embellishment. This is a documented reality. When the family escaped to what was then British Palestine, the menorah traveled with them, not a symbolic item, but as a family necessity. Every Jewish household needed one for Hanukkah. Over the decades in Haifa, the menorah was eventually boxed up, stored away, forgotten, absorbed into the ordinary objects of immigrant lives. It wasn't rediscovered until the late 1930s by descendants sorting through old belongings. Inside a worn cardboard box, they found the menorah, the same one that faced the swastika, tarnished, dented, but intact. A physical survivor of 2 continents, 2 political systems, and a now famous moment in Jewish history. When Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, learned about the menorah and the photograph, they requested both items for permanent preservation. Why? Because the menorah represented one of the rare artifacts that captured pre-Holocaust prayer life, Jewish domestic tradition, rising anti-Semitism, and the spiritual endurance of a family who refused to hide. It was recognized not as a religious object, but as a document of prayer history. Today, the menorah stands in the museum as a testimony, not just to what was lost, but to what survived. Once you assemble all the pieces, paramilitary headquarters, an illegal political banner, a Jewish family obeying ancient prayer tradition, a prophetic inscription in a traditional poetic form, a synagogue under threat, an escape timed with precision, a menorah that survived continents and decades, and a photograph that captured 2 colliding worlds. You no longer have a symbolic image. You have a chapter of prayer history. You have the record of a flame whose meaning was shaped by everything that came before it and everything that was soon to come after. And this is where the story moves towards its conclusion, not with the menorah itself, but with what it represents across time. When you look at the Posner's photograph, you're not just seeing a moment frozen in 1931. You're seeing the intersection of 3,000 years of prayer practice meeting one of the darkest decades in modern history. A light spoken into existence before nations existed, carried by a people through centuries of endurance, and preserved long enough to stand in the face of a regime that believed it could erase them. It didn't, because history shows again and again that the flame of a faithful people outlasts the darkness of their age. And this is why this story matters.